The morning light from 3 different suns painted the sky of Kepler 442b in colors that would make any human artist weep with joy. But Professor Vextar did not notice the beauty. His crystalline body stood 7 feet tall in the empty lecture hall, reviewing his student files one more time before the new semester began. For over 3,000 years, the Galactic Institute of Advanced Sciences had been the most respected school in known space. Only the brightest minds from 47 different worlds could attend. Professor Vextar taught the hardest class of all, Advanced Theoretical Physics. Students who passed his course went on to design faster-than-light engines, create artificial gravity systems, and solve the mysteries of the universe itself. The professor's crystal form flickered with satisfaction as he read through the names. There was Kira from the Centauri Republic, whose people could process mathematical equations in their sleep. Next was Thylon from the Silicon Worlds, whose race had evolved to understand quantum mechanics as naturally as breathing. The list continued, with brilliant students from every corner of the galaxy. Then Professor Vextar saw a name that made his crystal body dim with confusion. Lee Do-hyun, species, human. Origin, Sol 3, also known as Terra or Earth. The professor accessed the galactic database to refresh his memory about humans. They were newcomers to the galactic community, having achieved faster-than-light travel only 200 years ago. Their homeworld was a small, unremarkable planet in an outer arm of the galaxy. Most galactic citizens considered Earth to be backward and primitive. Humans had no natural telepathic abilities. They could not manipulate energy with their minds. They possessed no extra limbs or enhanced sensory organs. Their technology was basic compared to most galactic civilizations. Their lifespans were incredibly short by galactic standards. So how had this human qualified for the most challenging physics program in the galaxy? Professor Vextar checked the admission records. Lee Do-hyun had scored in the top 1% on the entrance examinations. The scores had to be verified 3 times because the admissions committee could not believe them. A human had outperformed candidates from races that had been studying advanced physics for millennia. The first students began entering the lecture hall. Professor Vextar watched as beings of incredible diversity took their seats. There were the gas-form entities from Nebula Prime, contained in their environmental suits. The insectoid scholars from the hive worlds chittered quietly in their mathematical language. Tall, graceful beings from the ethereal realms floated slightly above their chairs, their minds already connecting to the quantum field. Then Lee Do-hyun walked in. The human looked completely ordinary. He was young by galactic standards, probably. No more than 20 Earth years old. His skin was pale, his hair dark and simply cut. He wore plain clothes that looked handmade rather than manufactured. In one hand, he carried what appeared to be a primitive writing pad made of actual paper. In the other, he held a basic data device that looked at least 50 years out of date. Conversations stopped as Do-hyun walked to an empty seat in the middle of the lecture hall. Students stared with curiosity, amusement, and in some cases barely hidden contempt. What was a primitive human doing in their advanced physics class? Do-hyun seemed unaware of the attention. He sat down, opened his paper, notebook, and pulled out an ancient writing instrument. The pen looked like it had been used many times before, worn smooth by countless hours of writing. Kira leaned over to her study partner, Valdris from the Crystal Collective. "Did you know they still use paper on Earth?" she whispered. "How do they store and search information?" Valdris's crystalline form shimmered with amusement. "I heard humans still cook their own food instead of using molecular assemblers. They probably think writing by hand helps them remember better." Professor Vextar called for attention, and the whispers died down. He began his first lecture of the semester, Introduction to Quantum Temporal Mechanics. This was material so advanced that even the brilliant ethereal minds found it challenging. "Time," Professor Vextar began, his voice resonating through the hall with crystalline clarity. Flows in one direction throughout the universe. This is not merely an observation, but a fundamental law of reality itself. The professor displayed complex equations on the holographic board, mathematical symbols twisted through three-dimensional space, showing the relationship between time, space, and causality. The universal causality constant, he continued, prevents any interference with the natural flow of time. Backward time travel requires energy equivalent to the total output of 17 stars. Forward time travel is possible, but follows strict mathematical limitations. These facts have been proven through 10,000 years of research by the greatest minds in galactic history. Students throughout the hall took notes on their advanced data pads, their information instantly backed up to galactic databases. Mathematical formulas flowed directly into their enhanced memory systems. Some species could absorb the entire lecture directly into their consciousness without any conscious effort. Professor Vextar noticed that the human was writing everything down by hand in his paper notebook. The primitive method seemed incredibly slow and inefficient. How could he possibly keep up with the advanced concepts being presented? The mathematics of temporal mechanics, the professor explained, show us why causality must remain constant. Any variation would create paradoxes that could unravel the fabric of reality itself. More equations filled the air. The universal causality constant dominated the center of the mathematical display, surrounded by supporting formulas that had been refined over millennia of study. These principles, Professor Vextar declared with the confidence of absolute knowledge, represent the final word on temporal physics. No force in the universe can alter the flow of time without catastrophic consequences. That was when it happened. A simple hand rose in the middle of the lecture hall. Every eye in the room turned to look at the human student who had dared to interrupt Professor Vextar during one of his complex explanations. Do-hyun's voice was quiet, but clear as he spoke in accented galactic standard. "Professor, I have a question." The lecture hall fell completely silent. In 3,000 years of teaching, Professor Vextar had rarely been interrupted during his opening lectures. Students typically spent weeks absorbing the basic concepts before they felt confident enough to ask questions, and certainly no first-year student from a primitive world had ever challenged fundamental galactic physics on the first day of class. Professor Vextar's crystalline form flickered with surprise and curiosity. This should be interesting. He had heard that humans were known for asking unusual questions, though he had assumed this was simply due to their limited understanding of advanced concepts. "Yes, human Do-hyun," the professor said, his tone carrying the patient authority of millennia spent in academic halls. "Please state your question." Do-hyun stood up respectfully, his paper notebook still open in his hands. Around the lecture hall, the most brilliant young minds in the galaxy waited to hear what the primitive human could possibly ask about concepts that had challenged their species for thousands of years. What none of them realized was that they were about to witness the beginning of the greatest academic revolution in galactic history. The simple question that was about to leave the humans' lips would shatter everything they thought they knew about physics, time, and the nature of intelligence itself. The human student had raised his hand, and nothing would ever be the same. The silence in the lecture hall was so complete that even the gentle hum of the environmental systems seemed loud. Professor Vextar had seen many things in his long academic career, but a first-year student interrupting his opening lecture on temporal mechanics was not one of them. Do-hyun remained standing, his worn paper notebook balanced in one hand. His dark eyes looked directly at the professor without fear or arrogance, only genuine curiosity. Around him, 46 of the galaxy's brightest students waited to hear what the primitive human could possibly contribute to a discussion of advanced physics. "Your equation assumes that causality flows in a linear stream," Do-hyun began, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall. "But what if we think about time differently? On my home world, we have an old saying, still waters run deep. Several students exchanged glances. Was the human seriously comparing advanced temporal physics to water? Do-hyun continued, seemingly unaware of the skeptical looks around him. What if the universal causality constant isn't really constant? What if it only looks constant because we've been watching it from inside the current itself? Kira from the Centauri Republic couldn't contain herself. That's completely impossible, she said loudly. The mathematics have been proven for over 10,000 years. Every civilization that has studied temporal physics has reached the same conclusions. Other students nodded in agreement. Thailand from the Silicon Worlds added his support. The universal causality constant has been measured by 47 different species using completely different methods. The results are always identical. Do-hyun looked around the room with interest, as if he were genuinely surprised by their certainty. That's very interesting, he said. But may I ask you something? Have all 47 species been looking at time the same way? Professor Vextar found himself drawn into the discussion despite his better judgment. What do you mean by that, human Do-hyun? Well, Do-hyun said, pulling out his ancient pen. When I was young, I used to help my grandfather fix engines in his garage. He taught me something important. When every mechanic in town says a broken engine can't be repaired, sometimes the problem isn't with the engine. Sometimes the problem is that every mechanic learned to fix engines the same way. The human opened his notebook and began sketching simple diagrams. My grandfather once spent 3 days trying to fix an old motor using every technique he knew. Nothing worked. Then my little sister walked into the garage and asked why he didn't just ask the motor what was wrong with it. Valdris from the Crystal Collective shimmered with amusement. Engines don't speak, human. They are mechanical devices. Do-hyun smiled. That's what my grandfather said too. But then he realized my sister was right in a different way. He had been so focused on what he thought should work that he wasn't listening to what the motor was actually telling him. The sounds it made, the way it vibrated, the pattern of its failures. When he started paying attention to what the motor was showing him, instead of what his training told him to look for, he found the problem in 10 minutes. Professor Vextar's crystalline form flickered with growing interest. And you believe this applies to temporal physics? How? May I show you something, Professor? Do-hyun asked politely. It's just a thought experiment. Something my grandfather taught me while we were working on that old engine. The professor gestured toward the holographic display board. Very well, please proceed. Do-hyun walked to the front of the lecture hall, his simple clothes and primitive writing tools looking out of place among the advanced technology. He began drawing on the display board, but instead of using the sophisticated holographic interface, he simply wrote with his pen on the clear surface. His first diagram was embarrassingly simple. He drew a straight line and labeled it Time Traditional View. Below that, he drew a series of interconnected circles and labeled it Time Grandfather's Engine View. In my grandfather's garage, Do-hyun explained as he drew, we learned that complex systems often look simple from the outside. But when you're inside the system, trying to fix it, you realize that everything is connected to everything else in ways you didn't expect. He added more circles to his diagram, connecting them with curved lines. What if time isn't a river flowing in one direction? What if it's more like the cooling system in an old car? The water seems to flow in a simple loop, but there are hidden chambers, bypass valves, and feedback systems that affect the whole operation. Students began leaning forward in their seats despite themselves. The human's diagrams were crude compared to their advanced mathematical models, but something about his simple approach was strangely compelling. Do-hyun wrote a new equation on the board. It was unlike anything the students had seen before. Instead of the complex mathematical symbols they were used to, he used simple variables and relationships that seemed almost childish in their basic nature. My grandfather always said that the best way to understand something complicated is to start with something simple and build up, Do-hyun continued. So what if we start with the assumption that time is like water in a pond instead of water in a river? Professor Vextar studied the human's equation with growing amazement. The mathematics were elementary, but the implications were staggering. If Do-hyun was right, then the universal causality constant wasn't measuring the flow of time itself. It was measuring their limited observation of time from within a single reference frame. This is fascinating, the professor admitted. But surely, you realize that this contradicts 10 millennia of established science? Do-hyun nodded seriously. Yes, sir. My grandfather's engine repair contradicted 30 years of established mechanical knowledge, too. But the engine started working. He turned back to the board and added another simple diagram. This one showed the same mathematical relationships that Professor Vexatar had presented earlier, but viewed from a completely different perspective. What if the reason all 47 species get the same measurements for the universal causality constant is because they're all measuring from the same relative position? Like mechanics, who all learned from the same textbook? The implications hit the lecture hall like a shockwave. If the human was correct, then every civilization in the galaxy had been studying temporal physics with a fundamental blind spot. They had all assumed that their perspective on time was the only possible perspective. Kira spoke up again, but her voice was less certain than before. Even if that were true, how would you test such a theory? You can't step outside of time to observe it from a different angle. Do-hyun's face lit up with genuine excitement. That's exactly what my grandfather said about the engine. But then we realized we didn't need to take the whole engine apart. We just needed to listen to it differently. He wrote one final equation on the board. This one was even simpler than the others, but it elegantly solved a paradox that had puzzled temporal physicists for centuries. Sometimes, Do-hyun said quietly, the most complex problems have surprisingly simple solutions. You just have to be willing to ask the right questions. Professor Vexatar stared at the board in silence. Around the lecture hall, the brightest young minds in the galaxy were beginning to realize that their entire understanding of temporal mechanics might be fundamentally flawed. The human student had asked a simple question about water and broken engines. In doing so, he had opened a door that no one had even realized was there. Everything they thought they knew about time was about to change. The human student raised a hand and shattered an entire curriculum. 3 weeks had passed since Do-hyun's first question in Professor Vexatar's class. Word had spread quickly through the Galactic Institute about the human student who had challenged 10,000 years of temporal physics with drawings that looked like they came from a child's notebook. But Do-hyun was far from finished. In Professor Zalana's Advanced Energy Dynamics course, the tall blue-skinned instructor was explaining why massive fusion reactors were necessary to power interstellar ships. The mathematics were complex, involving plasma containment fields and quantum energy conversion rates that required enormous facilities and incredible amounts of rare materials. The energy requirements for faster-than-light travel, Professor Zalana declared with absolute confidence, can only be met through controlled fusion reactions. This has been proven by every spacefaring civilization. There simply is no other way to generate sufficient power in a compact enough form. Once again, a familiar hand rose from the middle of the classroom. Professor Zalana, Do-hyun said politely, I have a question about energy amplification. The professor's large blue eyes focused on the human student. Everyone in the institute had heard about Do-hyun by now. Yes, human Do-hyun. On my homeworld, my Aunt Soo-young studies rock formations for the Planetary Geology Department. She discovered something interesting about certain crystals. They seem to take in tiny amounts of energy from space and make them bigger. Much bigger. Several students laughed quietly. Valdris from the Crystal Collective was particularly amused. Crystals cannot amplify cosmic radiation to any useful degree, human. The energy output would be microscopic. Do-hyun reached into his simple cloth bag and pulled out what looked like an ancient timepiece. The watch was clearly very old, with a metal case that had been polished smooth by decades of handling. "This belonged to my great-grandfather," Do-Yun explained, holding up the device. "It has been running for over 60 years without any external power source. My Aunt Su-Yung studied the crystal inside and found that it uses natural oscillation of certain minerals to capture and focus ambient cosmic energy." Professor Zalana examined the primitive timepiece with her advanced sensors. Her expression changed from amusement to confusion to amazement as the readings came in. "This is impossible," she said quietly. "The energy conversion efficiency shown here exceeds our theoretical maximum by a factor of 12. Do-Hyun smiled. "My great-grandfather was a simple watchmaker. He never studied advanced physics. He just noticed that certain combinations of crystals and metals seemed to work better than others. He spent 40 years experimenting in his small shop, trying different arrangements until he found ones that worked." "But the mathematics," protested Kira, who was also taking this class. "Our models show that such energy amplification violates basic thermodynamic principles." "That's what my aunt thought too," Do-Yun replied, until she realized that the crystals weren't violating thermodynamics. They were using principles that our models didn't account for. The ambient cosmic radiation that fills all space isn't random. It has patterns, rhythms, cycles that can be predicted and used. He opened his notebook and began sketching another simple diagram. "My great-grandfather called it listening to the heartbeat of the universe. He said that once you learned to hear the rhythm, you could build devices that danced with it instead of fighting against it." Professor Zalana studied the watch more carefully. The technology was incredibly primitive by galactic standards, but the results were undeniable. This simple human timepiece was achieving energy conversion rates that their most advanced laboratories could not match. In the days that followed, more stories emerged from other classes. In Dr. Thainwell's biological adaptation theory course, Do-Hyun mentioned his sister Min-hee, who worked on their family farm. "Min-hee grows crops that shouldn't be able to survive in our soil," Do-Hyun told the class of biology students. "The planetary, agricultural department said it was impossible. The plants need nutrients that don't exist in our region and water conditions that we can't provide." Dr. Thainwell, whose species had mastered genetic engineering millions of years ago, was skeptical. "Biological adaptation cannot occur that quickly, human. It requires carefully controlled laboratory conditions and genetic manipulation techniques." "That's what the agricultural experts told my sister," Do-Yun agreed. "But she said the plants were trying to tell her what they needed. She just had to learn how to listen." He described how Min-hee would spend hours in the fields, observing how different plants responded to changes in soil, water, and light. She noticed patterns that the agricultural scientists had missed because they were focused on their theoretical models instead of watching what the plants actually did. Min-hee discovered that plants communicate with each other through their root systems, Do-Hyun explained. When she planted different species in certain patterns, they would share nutrients and information. The strong plants would help the weak. Ones adapt to difficult conditions. Dr. Thainwell checked the Galactic Botanical Database. What the human described as simple farming techniques were actually advanced agricultural methods that most civilizations considered theoretical possibilities at best. Another human student, Hyon, had quietly enrolled in the stellar engineering program. When he mentioned that his uncle Jinho had designed more efficient solar collectors using patterns inspired by flower petals, his professor nearly fainted. "The sunflowers in our backyard," Hyon explained to his shocked classmates, "turn to follow the sun all day long. My uncle wondered why our solar collectors couldn't do the same thing, but better. He studied how the flower petals were arranged and copied the pattern for his energy collectors." What Hyon described as backyard experimentation represented breakthrough, technology that stellar engineers had been trying to develop for centuries. The mathematical principles involved were so advanced that most civilizations couldn't even understand them theoretically, let alone implement them practically. Faculty meetings at the Institute became emergency sessions. Dean Mordek, whose species had achieved interstellar travel when humans were still discovering fire, found himself facing the greatest crisis in the school's 3,000-year history. "These humans aren't just lucky," Professor Vextar reported during one particularly tense meeting. "Student Do Hyun solved a temporal paradox that our greatest theoretical physicists have worked on for 17 centuries. He did it by comparing time travel to fixing a broken clock spring." Professor Zalana added her own disturbing observations. "The human female student, Yunji, just redesigned our quantum computer systems using principles she learned from watching. Her grandmother weaved traditional patterns. Her design is 43% more efficient than our current technology and uses 60% less power." Dr. Thainwell shook his head in bewilderment. "Student Minjun has revolutionized our understanding of interstellar navigation by applying lessons he learned from his father's fishing techniques. Apparently, human fishermen have been reading ocean currents and weather patterns using methods that are more sophisticated than our computer models." The evidence was overwhelming and terrifying. These humans, from their small backward planet, were casually outperforming the greatest minds in galactic civilization, and they seemed completely unaware that what they were doing should have been impossible. The academic establishment of 47 different species was beginning to crumble, and it was all because a few human students had started asking simple questions about complex problems. The revolution had begun, and no one knew where it would end. Dean Mordek had lived for over 3,000 years. His species, the Eternal Guardians, had witnessed the rise and fall of entire civilizations. They had seen stars born and die. They had watched primitive species evolve into spacefaring empires. But in all his vast experience, he had never encountered anything like the current crisis at the Galactic Institute. The emergency faculty assembly was the largest in the school's history. Representatives from all 47 member civilizations had traveled to Kepler 442b to understand what was happening. The Great Assembly Hall, normally used only for graduation ceremonies, was filled with the most brilliant academic minds in the galaxy. Dean Mordek stood at the center of the hall, his ancient form radiating the authority of millennia. "We are facing an unprecedented situation," he began, his voice carrying easily through the vast space. "These human students are not simply performing well in their classes. They are fundamentally challenging the basic principles that underlie our entire educational system." Professor Vextar stepped forward to present his report. His crystalline form flickered with patterns that indicated deep confusion mixed with genuine excitement. "Student Do-hyun has now solved 6 different temporal paradoxes that have puzzled our greatest theoretical physicists for centuries," he reported. In each case, he used analogies from simple mechanical repairs that he learned from his grandfather. Yesterday, he explained how to prevent causality loops by comparing them to preventing water hammer in old plumbing systems. A murmur of disbelief swept through the assembly. Water hammer was a simple mechanical problem that any basic technician could fix. How could it possibly relate to advanced temporal mechanics? Professor Zalana presented her findings next. "The human female student Yunji has redesigned our primary quantum computer array. She used weaving patterns that she learned from her grandmother to create quantum logic gates that are more efficient than anything we have achieved in 2,000 years of research. She activated a holographic display showing Yunji's design. The pattern was beautiful in its simplicity, resembling traditional textile work more than advanced technology. Yet the mathematical analysis was undeniable. The design worked better than their most sophisticated systems. When I asked her how she knew the pattern would work," Professor Zalana continued, "she said her grandmother always told her that the best weaves are the ones where every thread supports every other thread. She applied the same principle to quantum processing pathways." Dr. Thainwell added his own shocking discoveries. "Student Tai Hyung has revolutionized our approach to biological adaptation. Using techniques he learned from his mother's garden, he has solved protein folding problems that have challenged our best xenobiologists for decades. The assembly hall grew quieter as the implications began to sink in. These weren't isolated incidents. The human students were systematically outperforming galactic civilization's finest minds across multiple scientific disciplines. Dean Mordeck raised his hand for silence. We have authorized a comprehensive investigation into human educational methods. Professor Nexara will present our findings. Professor Nexara, the Institute's leading expert in comparative intelligence, approached the center of the hall. Her species, the mind readers of Proxima, had evolved to understand the thinking processes of other races. If anyone could explain what was happening with the humans, it would be her. We have conducted extensive analysis of human learning methods, she began, her telepathic voice reaching every mind in the assembly simultaneously. What we discovered challenges everything we thought we knew about intelligence and education. She activated a complex display showing brain scans, learning patterns, and cognitive maps from dozens of different species. Every other known species develops intelligence through specialization, Professor Nexara explained. As our minds mature, we become more focused on specific areas of knowledge. This allows us to achieve great depth of understanding within our chosen fields. The display showed neural pathways becoming more defined and specialized as various alien species matured intellectually. Humans develop differently, she continued. Their brains maintain flexibility throughout their entire lives. Instead of specializing, they continue to make new connections between seemingly unrelated areas of knowledge. A new section of the display showed human brain patterns. Unlike the neat, organized neural pathways of other species, human brains showed chaotic tangles of connections linking every area to every other area. This neural architecture allows humans to see patterns that escape even our most brilliant specialists, Professor Nexara explained. When a human studies physics, their brain automatically connects that information to music, art, cooking, sports, and every other experience they have ever had. Ambassador Zekthera from the Logic Dominion spoke up. Surely such chaos must limit their ability to achieve deep understanding in any single field. That is what we assumed, Professor Nexara replied. But our analysis shows the opposite. The constant cross-connections actually enhance human understanding. When they study a complex problem, they can draw insights from completely unrelated experiences. She showed specific examples from the human student's work. When Doyon solved the temporal causality problem, his brain was simultaneously accessing memories of clock repair, water flow, musical rhythm, and even childhood games. All of these experiences contributed to his breakthrough. The assembly fell silent as they absorbed this information. The implications were staggering. Professor Nexara continued her presentation. Human education actively encourages this cross-connection process. They do not separate knowledge into rigid categories like we do. A human studying physics might also study music, literature, and agriculture. Their schools encourage students to find connections between different subjects. She showed examples of human educational methods. Unlike the specialized training programs used throughout the galaxy, human schools seemed almost chaotic in their approach. Students were encouraged to explore widely rather than focus deeply. Most shocking of all, Professor Nexara said, humans value questions more than answers. Their greatest thinkers are celebrated not for providing definitive solutions, but for asking questions that open new paths of inquiry. This revelation sent shockwaves through the assembly. Every galactic civilization had developed education systems based on accumulating and preserving knowledge. The idea of valuing questions over answers seemed completely backwards. Dean Mordeck stepped forward again. Are you telling us that these humans have developed superior intelligence by being less organized and less focused than the rest of us? Not superior, Professor Nexara corrected. Different. Human intelligence evolved for pattern recognition and creative problem-solving in unpredictable environments. While our species developed specialized intelligence for specific tasks, humans developed generalized intelligence that can find unexpected connections between any concepts. She paused, letting the full implications sink in. In essence, humans have maintained the learning flexibility that most species lose as they mature. They approach every problem with the curiosity of a child and the experience of an adult. This combination allows them to see solutions that our specialized minds cannot perceive. Ambassador Kreldan from the technocracy spoke up nervously. What does this mean for the established order? If human methods are superior, does that invalidate our entire approach to science and education? Dean Mordek looked around the assembly hall at the worried faces of the galaxy's greatest educators. The question hanging in the air was unspoken, but clear. If a few human students could casually revolutionize their most advanced fields of study, what did that say about the intellectual supremacy that the established galactic civilizations had taken for granted? The investigation had revealed the truth, but the truth was more disturbing than anyone had imagined. The humans weren't trying to show off their superiority. They were genuinely confused by the complexity of problems that seemed simple to them. They had no idea that their casual observations were shattering the foundations of galactic science, and that perhaps was the most revolutionary discovery of all. News of the human students' achievements spread across the galaxy faster than a quantum communication pulse. Within weeks, delegations from the most powerful civilizations were arriving at the Galactic Institute, demanding to understand how primitive humans were outperforming their finest minds. The delegation from the hegemony of pure logic arrived first. These beings had evolved beyond physical form millions of years ago, existing as pure mathematical thought. They considered themselves the ultimate expression of intelligence in the universe. High Coordinator Zethmar, speaking through a crystalline communication device, addressed Dean Mordek directly. We demand immediate access to these humans. They must be using some form of technological enhancement that your scans have failed to detect. Dean Mordek, despite his 3,000 years of diplomatic experience, felt overwhelmed by the situation. I assure you, High Coordinator, we have tested the humans extensively. They show no signs of enhancement, genetic modification, or technological augmentation. Impossible, Zethmar replied, his mathematical voice resonating with absolute certainty. Primitive biological intelligence cannot exceed the capabilities of pure logical thought. There must be an explanation. Meanwhile, Do-hyun continued attending his classes, completely unaware that his casual observations were causing panic in the highest levels of galactic civilization. In Professor Kalin's advanced mathematics course, he had just solved a theorem that had puzzled scholars for over 2 millennia. When the investigation team questioned him about his methods, Do-hyun looked genuinely confused by their intensity. I just remembered how my mother taught me to fold paper cranes when I was little, he explained, scratching his head in bewilderment. The solution was right there in the folding pattern. You start with something flat and simple, then you make careful folds that support each other, and eventually you create something that can fly. The team of investigators stared at him in silence. They had expected to find hidden technology, secret knowledge, or at least some awareness of the magnitude of his achievement. Instead, they found a young man who seemed genuinely surprised that anyone found his solution remarkable. High Coordinator Zethmar was not satisfied with simple questioning. He demanded that Do-hyun be subjected to the most advanced scanning technology available. For 3 days, the human student was examined by machines that could detect quantum-level modifications to his cellular structure. They found nothing except a perfectly ordinary human being who had grown up helping his family run a small restaurant in a modest city on an unremarkable planet. The most advanced technology on my homeworld, Do-hyun told his increasingly frustrated interrogators, is probably my grandmother's rice cooker. She's had it for 30 years and it still works perfectly. She always said the secret is understanding. What the machine is trying to tell you. The investigators began to realize they were facing something far more disturbing than hidden technology. The humans weren't cheating or using secret knowledge. They were simply thinking in ways that the galaxy's most advanced civilizations couldn't understand. Other human students were questioned with similar results. Seo-yeon, who had revolutionized energy distribution systems, explained that she had learned the principles from watching traditional Korean dance performances. "My aunt was a dancer," she told the bewildered scientists. "She taught me that the most beautiful dances are the ones where energy flows smoothly from one movement to the next. Nothing is wasted, nothing is forced. I just applied the same principle to power grid management." What she described as simple artistic appreciation represented breakthrough engineering that most civilizations considered impossible to achieve without massive computational resources. Min Jun, who had solved interstellar navigation problems using fishing techniques, seemed equally unaware of his achievement's significance. "My father taught me to read ocean currents and wind patterns when we went fishing," he explained. "You learn to feel the water's rhythm, to understand where the fish want to go instead of where you think they should go. Space currents work the same way. You just need to listen to what the cosmic winds are telling you." His casual description of feeling gravitational currents and listening to cosmic radiation patterns represented navigation technology that surpassed anything the galaxy had ever seen. The investigation teams returned to their respective civilizations with reports that shook the foundations of galactic society. The humans weren't using advanced technology. They weren't genetically enhanced. They weren't hiding secret knowledge. They were simply ordinary people who had learned to think in ways that made the impossible seem natural. The technocratic union was the first to crack under the pressure. Their entire civilization was built on the principle that technological advancement required increasingly complex specialization. The idea that simple, intuitive approaches could outperform their most sophisticated systems was literally unthinkable within their worldview. Supreme Tech Lord Variance called an emergency session of the Galactic Council. Representatives from all 47 civilizations gathered in the neutral space station that served as the galaxy's political center. "We are facing an existential crisis," Variance announced to the assembled delegates. "If these human methods are truly superior to our own, then everything we have built, everything we have achieved, everything we have believed about intelligence itself may be fundamentally flawed." Ambassador Kreldan from the Silicon Collectives agreed. "Our entire educational system is based on the principle that knowledge must be compartmentalized and specialized. But these humans seem to thrive on making connections between unrelated subjects." The debate that followed lasted for days. Some civilizations argued for immediately adopting human teaching methods. Others insisted that there must be some flaw in the humans' approach that they hadn't discovered yet. The delegation from the ethereal realms proposed the most disturbing possibility of all. "What if," asked Ambassador Lethari, "the humans are not superior to us? What if they are simply different? What if there are multiple valid approaches to intelligence, and we have all been following only one path?" The implications of this suggestion were staggering. For millions of years, galactic civilization had been built on the assumption that there was one correct way to develop intelligence, through specialization, logical analysis, and systematic knowledge accumulation. If the humans represented an equally valid but completely different approach to intelligence, then the established galactic hierarchy might be nothing more than an arbitrary accident of evolution. While the politicians debated, the academic revolution continued spreading. Students from across the galaxy began requesting transfer to the Galactic Institute, hoping to study alongside the human students and learn their mysterious methods. Professor Vexitar found himself teaching classes that were more like philosophy sessions than physics lectures. Students who had previously accepted established scientific principles without question were now asking why those principles existed and whether they could be understood differently. The human students, meanwhile, continued their education with the same casual brilliance that had started the revolution. They seemed genuinely puzzled by all the attention their work was receiving. "We're not doing anything special," Do-hyun told a reporter from the Galactic News Network. "We're just asking questions and trying to understand things. Isn't that what students are supposed to do?" His innocent response was broadcast throughout the galaxy, and it carried a message that no one could ignore. The most advanced civilizations in known space had somehow forgotten the fundamental purpose of education. They had become so focused on preserving and transferring existing knowledge that they had lost the ability to create new knowledge. The humans, with their primitive technology and chaotic learning methods, had maintained something that the galaxy's greatest civilizations had accidentally abandoned: the courage to question everything and the wisdom to find new answers. The revolution was no longer just academic. It was becoming cultural, philosophical, and potentially political. And it had all started because a human student raised his hand and asked a simple question about time and broken engines. 1 year had passed since Do-hyun first raised his hand in Professor Vextar's class. The Galactic Institute of Advanced Sciences looked nothing like the institution it had been 12 months earlier. The rigid lecture halls had been redesigned, with flexible seating arrangements that could be reconfigured for group discussions. The sterile white walls now displayed artwork, natural patterns, and creative visualizations alongside mathematical equations. Most shocking of all, the library had added a section devoted entirely to what humans called children's books. Simple stories that somehow contained profound insights about complex subjects. Dean Mordek stood in his office, looking out at the courtyard, where students from 47 different species sat in mixed groups, discussing everything from quantum mechanics to poetry. A year ago, such mixing of academic disciplines would have been considered a waste of time. Now it was mandatory curriculum. Professor Vextar knocked and entered the dean's office. The crystalline being's form flickered with patterns that indicated excitement mixed with lingering bewilderment. "The transformation is remarkable," he said, settling into his chair. "Student Do-hyun's Simple Questions Institute has received applications from over 3 million students across the galaxy. We're having to turn away candidates from civilizations that we once considered our intellectual superiors." Dean Mordek nodded slowly. The changes had been overwhelming, but the results were undeniable. Test scores had improved across all subjects. More importantly, students were beginning to make breakthrough discoveries at an unprecedented rate. "How are our faculty adapting to the new teaching methods?" the dean asked. "Better than expected," Professor Vextar replied. "Yesterday, Professor Zelana taught a class on energy dynamics using finger painting techniques that she learned from human children's education materials. Her students achieved a deeper understanding of quantum field interactions than any previous class had managed." Through the office window, they could see Do-hyun himself sitting under a tree with a group of students from various species. He was demonstrating something with simple wooden blocks while explaining advanced engineering principles. The mixed group hung on his every word, occasionally asking questions that sparked animated discussions. The transformation hadn't been limited to the institute. Across the galaxy, educational institutions were scrambling to adopt what had become known as human-style learning. The results were causing upheaval in academic circles everywhere. Dr. Thanewell entered the office, carrying a datapad filled with reports from across the galactic community. "The latest statistics are in," she announced. "Universities that have implemented interdisciplinary thinking programs are reporting breakthrough discoveries at a rate 40 times higher than traditional institutions. The Technocratic Union has completely restructured their educational system. Even the hegemony of pure logic has started encouraging their students to study art and music alongside mathematics." Dean Mordek shook his head in amazement. "A year ago, if someone had told me that the galaxy's most logical civilization would be teaching their students to finger paint, I would have recommended psychological evaluation." The changes went beyond mere academic curiosity. The human approach to problem-solving was revolutionizing entire industries. Faster-than-light travel had become more efficient thanks to navigation techniques inspired by human fishing methods. Energy production had increased dramatically through the application of principles learned from studying flower petals and traditional weaving patterns. Most remarkably, the rate of scientific discovery had accelerated exponentially. Problems that had remained unsolved for millennia were being resolved by student groups that combined expertise from completely different fields. Professor Vextar pulled up a holographic display showing the latest achievements. Team 7, consisting of a quantum physicist, a musician, a chef, and a gardener, just solved the unified field theory by comparing universal forces to ingredients in a recipe. Team 12 figured out how to create stable wormholes by studying the way certain flowers fold their petals. And all of this started with a human comparing time travel to clock repair, Dean Mordeck observed with something approaching awe. Do-hyun himself had become the most famous student in galactic history, but he remained characteristically modest about his role in the revolution. His Simple Questions Institute operated on principles that would have been considered absurd a year earlier. The institute's motto, carved in wood above the entrance in Do-hyun's own handwriting, read, "The best way to understand something complicated is to ask simple questions about it." The Institute's classes were unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. Students might spend a morning studying advanced mathematics, an afternoon learning traditional crafts, and an evening discussing philosophy, while cooking dinner together. The chaotic mixing of subjects that had once been kept rigidly separate was producing insights that no specialized approach had ever achieved. Seo-yeon, now a teaching assistant at the Institute, had developed new methods for understanding quantum mechanics by teaching students to dance. Her quantum ballet classes were among the most popular and effective physics courses ever created. "When you move your body through space," she would tell her students, "you understand the relationship between energy and motion in a way that no equation can teach you. Your muscles remember what your mind struggles to comprehend." Min-jun had created a navigation program that trained pilots by teaching them to fish. Students learned to read cosmic currents by first learning to read ocean tides, wind patterns, and the behavior of aquatic life. "Space is just another kind of ocean," he would explain. "Once you learn to feel the rhythm of one, you can learn to feel the rhythm of any other." The success of these unconventional methods had forced the entire galaxy to reconsider fundamental assumptions about intelligence, education, and the nature of knowledge itself. High Coordinator Zethmar, from the hegemony of pure logic, had perhaps undergone the most dramatic transformation of all. The being who had once insisted that primitive biological intelligence could never exceed pure logical thought was now one of the Institute's most enthusiastic supporters. "We spent millions of years developing the perfect logical framework," he admitted during a recent interview. "But we forgot that logic is just a tool. The humans never forgot that the purpose of the tool is to understand reality, not to replace it." Ambassador Lethari from the ethereal realms had established the first mixed-method university in her home system, where students from different species learned together using both their traditional methods and human-inspired approaches. "We discovered that our telepathic abilities work much better when we also engage our other senses," she reported. "Humans taught us that the mind and body are not separate things, but parts of one integrated system." As Dean Mordeck reflected on the changes, he realized that the human revolution had done more than just improve educational methods. It had reminded the galaxy of something that most civilizations had forgotten in their rush toward specialization and technological advancement, the joy of learning itself. Students throughout the galaxy were rediscovering the excitement of asking questions, making connections, and exploring ideas for the pure pleasure of understanding. The rigid hierarchies that had dominated galactic education for millennia were giving way to collaborative communities where everyone was both teacher and student. Professor Vextar summarized the transformation perfectly. The humans didn't teach us new facts about the universe. They taught us how to see the universe with fresh eyes. In the courtyard below, Do-yoon finished his demonstration with the wooden blocks and looked up at the office window. He smiled and waved, the same simple, genuine expression that had accompanied his first question about time and causality. The young man who had casually mentioned his grandfather's engine repair philosophy had fundamentally changed the way an entire galaxy approached learning and discovery. But perhaps most remarkably of all, he had done it by maintaining the curiosity, humility, and wonder that the galaxy's most advanced civilizations had somehow lost along their path to greatness. The human student had raised his hand and asked a simple question. In doing so, he had reminded the galaxy that the greatest discoveries often begin not with complex theories or sophisticated technologies, but with three simple words. I wonder why. The revolution was complete, but in many ways, it was just beginning. Across the galaxy, millions of students were learning to ask better questions, make unexpected connections, and approach old problems with fresh perspectives. And it had all started because one human student had the courage to compare the mysteries of the universe to fixing a broken clock in his grandfather's garage.